This is the Nomad Futurist podcast, a podcast about the evolution of technology, society, and transformation. Connect with us, share your thoughts with us at nomadfuturist.com. Let's get this started. Here are Phil and Nabeel.
Hello. Welcome to Nomad Futurist. This is your co-host, Nabeel Mahmood, currently from Scottsdale, Arizona.
This is your co-host, Philip Koblence from Montclair, New Jersey.
Hello there. I'm Dee Smith. I am currently in Data Center Alley in Northern Virginia. Thanks for having me.
Well, Dee, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. Certainly not the Northern Virginia accent. We'll get back to that in just a bit. Could you share at a high level, what are you doing these days? What are you up to?
I'm up to some interesting stuff at the minute. I am currently working on multiple initiatives. Right now, I'm working with small companies, helping them to build growth in the industry, to understand from their product development cycle through to execution, where their gaps are, and how to build and transform their companies, which has been very interesting. I've also been working on an AI framework from a governance perspective. AI has absolutely exploded in the last 18 months, but there continues to be a gap around governance. And I'm afraid the genie's out of the bottle, but it's never too late to create some structure and framework around that. I'm also doing a fair amount of mentorship, which is really interesting for me because we have a huge talent gap. And that's been something I've been really passionate about. I'm also quite involved from a sustainability perspective with the Tech for Climate Action series, which has been really interesting for me, meeting with government, meeting with industry, just to understand what the world is doing and what all the initiatives are that everybody's working on.
That's quite a lot that you've got going on. And I think one of the things that we want to talk about here, probably a great plug-in, is talk about powering potential, and Nomad Futurist partnering up with you in helping support the initiative of powering potential internationally. So could you just add a little flavor to that?
So Powering Potential is a nonprofit organization that I got involved with a few years ago. I was invited to join the board, and I've been really particular about where I put my energy because I've always had multiple interests. This particular program appealed to me really because it resonates from a sustainability perspective. It resonates from an education perspective, and it resonates with me because there's quite a lot of technology involved. Coming out of Africa, we have had a lot of challenges, particularly with power. And over multiple years, played around with alternative energy. It was always an interesting thing for me. South Africa in particular battled a lot with power outages and at the moment live in a constant state of inconsistent power. Powering Potential is a organization that provides laptops, computers, solar power, and we train teachers on how to teach the kids technology skills so that we create digital advocates for our industry going forward. But we also bring more people into the industry. And education is obviously key to building the future. So all of those angles really suited me. And I've always been passionate about all of those aspects. So it was a good match for me. We worked really hard to raise funds so that we can get computers, get them installed using solar power. And then we work with the local organization, effectively teaching people how to fish by giving them skills they need to be able to empower the next generation of learners. Nomad Futurist has been very helpful with the donations of computers. And going forward, we intend to get computers into 250 schools in what we call the Karatu district in Tanzania, which is a very rural, very remote area of Tanzania. But of course, the students are as keen as any student anywhere in the world. So it's important for us to make sure they get the same advantages and privileges as any other student does in the world.
Wonderful. Well, that fits in with our founding values, and we are very excited to partner up with you. So for those listeners, we'll actually have more details on the initiative and the sponsorship drive. So if you're listening to this podcast today and are watching the YouTube channel, make sure to subscribe and follow us, and we will be sharing details on this partnership and what do we need from you guys.
that how content creation works these days? You have to like smash that subscribe button down below.
There you go. Yeah, we're going to have to point that down here somewhere. There's a subscribe button.
It'll learn how to do
It's
that.
really very important to do that because we have to grow skills and we have to make sure we've got enough talent in the industry going forward to do so. With the content that Nomad Futurist is going to give us over the next several weeks, we're going to be introducing that into our school curriculum in the secondary schools in Tanzania. So we're going to create a pipeline for talent into the future as well, which is amazing.
So this desire you have to help foster the next generation, particularly in these areas that you pronounce a lot better than I do. And I imagine that that pronunciation doesn't come from life spent in Northern Virginia. So can you give us a little bit of background? Like what drives you to have such passion for the African subcontinent, South Africa, Tanzania, et cetera? Maybe a little bit about your upbringing. Where did you grow up and how did you get here?
So I was born in Cape Town in South Africa. Grew up primarily in Johannesburg, traveled quite a lot throughout my career, 40 odd countries, a lot of work in Africa, though, specifically. I grew up from a career perspective, primarily in financial services, fairly quickly moved into technology in financial services, firstly as a business analyst, and then I went into project and program management, covering infrastructure, applications, data. And then I kind of got introduced into the data center industry because I had a number of global projects that involved data centers, and I actually didn't know anything about them. So that was really interesting, coupled with some of the power issues that we experience, and we call it load shedding in South Africa. You can have anything from 4 hours to 16 hours without power, which makes life really, really challenging just for the average person, never mind for any kind of corporate. And of course, you can imagine the complexity that comes with doing that in a data center, right? It's really, really complicated. So I got stuck with these projects. I had no idea what to do. It was really interesting. Walked into a room for the first project. There were 17 men and I was completely clueless. And I thought, oh dear, there's nothing I hate more in the world than feeling like the dumbest person in the room. So I got on a plane. I went to Singapore. I did a whole lot of formal training. I interviewed a ton of people.
Was that on your own or was that something that was sponsored by the companies that you were working with at that point?
At that point, it was sponsored by the company I was working with. But coming out of that, having delivered a number of data center projects, we ended up doing a lot more outside of that, which we paid for. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So it was interesting. What I learned was that despite there being 17 people in the room, you actually needed all 17 people because they all came from different disciplines, which talks about how very vast the industry is. So that's what happened. I kind of got involved that way and ended up doing upgrades, then ended up getting involved in new builds, then in a number of migrations, and I just kept learning continuously. And as I traveled throughout Africa, I learned that everybody had similar issues. And it was quite a big thing to see the lack of skill, primarily the lack of education. I had an MBA and it helped me with financial and commercial aspects of the project, but it didn't help me to learn anything else about the data center industry. So just surrounding yourself with a lot of really clever people, continuously learning and doing the training helped me quite a lot. I kind of got involved in Tanzania when I went to climb Kilimanjaro. I think it was 2007. And I thought, wow, that's an amazing country. And the people were amazing as well. I got back and finished all the projects. And I got sick around about that time. I got a brain tumor. And took some time out and decided that I was all good. But it turns out that I wasn't all good. Doctor said, live or work. I said, I love to work. We're going to do that. And he said, wrong answer. You need to live. Anyway, that was a lot of fun. So took a few weeks, but the phone just didn't stop ringing. And resigned from that company and started consulting 1 day a week. And then very quickly I was working full time. And that's kind of what led to starting a consulting company. And I worked with a lot of companies across multiple industries and all over Africa, actually. I worked with companies who needed turnaround strategies. I worked with companies who needed transformation. companies who needed to build new data centers or upgrade their data centers. And I worked a lot in the execution space as well. And I loved it. So remember that company that I talked about that I went to train in Singapore at? It was probably a year later, they approached me and they said, hey, you've done a lot of training with us. Would you be interested in doing that training across sub-Saharan Africa? And I thought, that's a really good idea because there was no place for me to go for training when I was looking for training. And I thought, grand. So I started a division and started delivering training, doing lots of different courses. So from data center design, data center operations, facilities management, risk management, migrations, and several other aspects of the data center. I think we trained about 90% of the people on the African continent, which was amazing. That quickly spread Middle East Africa, Northern Africa, Asia, and Europe as well. And so as we had clients in the transformation space, we kind of incorporated a lot of the data center business in there as well. So it grew fairly quickly and it was a lot of fun. And we ended up working on 5 continents.
That's amazing. So when did you come to America, or what brought you to America?
So 2nd of April, I would have been in the US for 6 years. An interesting story. One of the clients that I did a lot of transformation work for offered me an opportunity to move to the US. They basically said, pick a country. And because I had done work for them in Western Virginia, actually, I kind of liked the spot. And I thought, oh, why not? That's a really, really good place to be. And so they said, well, off you go. And so they picked us up and they put us here. I will tell you, at 40, it's not a lot of fun relocating on such a grand scale. It's not for the faint-hearted, but certainly it was interesting. And yeah, it's been quite the ride ever since.
It was hard enough to move homes at 40 years old. I can't even imagine uprooting and moving what I imagined was your whole family, right? At that point. Was that a difficult conversation to have? Was everyone kind of on board with it? Or were you like, oh, what? I decided we're all moving to Virginia.
Well, I first had to get past the man, right?
I've met the man. I can imagine that was fun.
Yeah. He was
he's
like,
easygoing.
have you lost your mind? What is wrong with you? I said, but honey, you've never been. And he said, yeah, there's a darn good reason for that. And I said, just come look, just come see. And so he came and they all came and they spent 2 weeks here. And I think he was a little in love with the place. And then we got back and he said, I suppose we could do that for a little while.
And now he's like the governor of Virginia. It's amazing.
Please don't give him any idea. That's not
he's going to run. He's going to
No,
run.
I
I have so many things written down that you just kind of pass because your story is just fascinating. I'm trying to think of like, do I start with Kilimanjaro? And I can't just yada yada past that. Do we move to brain tumor? And how do you get through that? And for me, it's like, I think everyone thinks that they have these challenges that come into their lives that are just so hard. And, oh, I've had a really hard week, or this customer is giving me some trouble, or this problem is unsolvable. But when you are faced with something like a brain tumor, which I've seen people, but the strength that it takes to get that type of diagnosis, and then kind of almost, that's where your story starts almost, as opposed to more people. I think I got the diagnosis. I'm just like huddling under my desk, like figuring out how could this happen to me? Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like? Like, where were you personally, professionally? You get the news that you have a brain tumor, which presumably comes not just by accident, but because of some symptoms that I imagine you get. And how do you deal with that?
Okay, I'll give you the short version. I hadn't been feeling well for about 18 months, but I was a woman. I had 3 daughters. I had a big career, multi-million-dollar portfolio, a lot of people I was managing. There was no time for nonsense. The doctors kept saying they couldn't find anything for about 18 months. And then eventually I just said to him, I'm not a hypochondriac. I don't pay attention to my body, but something's off and it can't be off for 18 months. Something's got to give. So you need to figure it out. And he said, oh, I think it's all in your head. So I said, I tell you what, let's do a deal. You do whatever test you like. And if you find nothing, I'll go see a psychologist. And we had a deal. Anyway, so he did a whole pile of tests. And then he called me one day and he said, I'd like to meet you at this hospital for an MRI tomorrow. And I said, that's ridiculous. I'm busy. And he said, no, you actually have to do this. I've already booked the appointment. So I went in for the appointment, had the MRI, went back to his office, sat down, and he said, oh, I'm sorry to tell you have a brain tumor. And I said, wonderful. So for 18 months, you told me I was losing it. Do I have a brain tumor? He said, yes. I said, okay, nice knowing you. And I left. I went to find a neurologist who gave me a whole pile of stuff and said, your quality of life is going to diminish. You're going to have a terrible time. It's just to give up work. You need to go home and figure out your new life. And I thought, you don't have 3 daughters, dude. This is not quite how life works. And by the way, I have work and I have a husband. I have a lot going on. And he said, well, you do you. And I said, great, I'll do me. So I did me. So I found a doctor who could treat me. And we figured out that I needed to go on this regime that required me to be sick every weekend, which was wonderful. So every Friday I rolled up to do my thing, and come Monday morning, I got up a whole lot of green. And that went on for a few months. And I thought, yeah, that just sucks. And my kids weren't having any
And what
fun.
is that? Is that chemo? Is that radiation? Yeah.
Yep. And I thought, yeah, this isn't working. So I went back and I said, okay, this isn't working for me. So you can't be 4 times sicker. So how about we take all of it and stick it all together into one dose? Because I can't be 4 times sicker. And then at least I have 3 weekends with my family. And he said, yeah, you'll die. And I said, yeah, I'll be okay. And he said, no, you'll die. And I said, I'll be fine. Let's just give it a shot. What's the worst thing that can happen? I can die. But I'm going to die anyway if we continue to do it this way, because I won't be there for my kids. And that's just like dying for me anyway if I'm not around for my family. So, short story, he was wrong. I was right. We worked it out. 7 years later, I got cleared and I got on with life for 6 days of the month. Wow.
I think the concept of like people talk about personal advocacy when it comes to healthcare and in general, and I think you're like the poster child for it, right? A lot of people want to think that a doctor says something to you and that's how it is and you're beholden to it. But the idea of listening to your body and then understanding what your motivations are and how you kind of will yourself through. Although I will say this, the first doctor said it was all in your head and he wasn't wrong.
He was not wrong. He was not wrong.
I think you owe him an apology.
I have so many things that I had on my list to say to him. Fortunately, I was brought up to be polite.
So how are you feeling now? And how long ago was this?
8, 9 years ago.
So it's certainly not an American doctor, Phil. That helps.
I might be going the other way. I'm moving to South
It
Africa.
was a bit like climbing Kilimanjaro, by the way, which is not a walk in the park. Climbing Kilimanjaro is a very interesting journey. There are some very long ups, some very large downs, some constant up and downs, and then a few flats. That journey was pretty similar.
And the fact that Kilimanjaro is like second on the list of feats of strength that Deidre Smith has undertaken is incredible. It's incredible. I have not done enough. I need to work on my bucket list.
Yeah.
No.
Well,
Those are little things. People go through much more difficult things in life. The things that come at us are the things that we're supposed to go through. And that's what you have to know, right? This is your journey. Somebody else's divorce could have been much worse than what my experience was. It just depends on your character and your motivation, and you never compare, right?
absolutely. Well, certainly a very touching story. I did lose my mother to brain tumor, and she fought for about 3 years. So it's amazing that you were able to make it through, and you're stronger than probably ever before.
I'm sorry to hear that. It's a terrible story.
Well, unfortunately, that's life. All right.
Right?
So
Let's turn this around a little bit. Maybe we should elevate. We're going to go with, all right. So you went through the brain tumor. You redoubled your efforts in this career path, which you had no eye on the horizon. Stepping back for a second, you started your career in financial services. Was that motivated by what your parents did for a living? Was that the normal trajectory for someone coming up? And was it
Where
such
I
a thing?
got my first job.
Right.
Well, it wasn't what I wanted to do when I was a kid. I was all over the map, right? I was going to be an air hostess. I was going to be a psychologist. I was going to be a mom. I was going to be a firefighter. I was all over the map. I was going to be a nurse. I was going to be a nun. Can you imagine?
We're going to be a nun.
It's real path.
Yeah, I wouldn't even know how or where does that get in the cards.
To be a nun. To be a nun. We love all the nuns out there. You guys are literally doing God's work.
All right. So you moved to America, you've reacquainted yourself. How do you see American culture as compared to South Africa and other parts of the world, particularly with education? Do we have similar challenges in the Americas? Are we addressing the human capital, and is it on the forefront as it's apparent in the underserved communities like South Africa being one? And are there enough women and minorities in our space?
Oh man, did you just open a can of worms?
That's our goal. We're cans of worms openers. Can openers.
So I think education is not equal everywhere, anywhere in the world, even in the US. I've learned that. I've learned that a lot more people have access to education in this country than you would find in Africa, for example. But if I look at some of the Asian countries, the education there is amazing, Europe as well. I think everywhere in the world there are underserved communities, and I think technology helps us to get education to them in a way that we couldn't have before. But that's taken many, many years to develop. I think that we ought to do as much as we possibly can to try to educate and to help any institution or foundation that is trying to drive education, because it's all we have, right? It's what determines the future of the world, the education that our kids have. So I think that's really important to me. I've been very involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion. In fact, I co-founded diversity, equity, and inclusion in the previous place that I worked. I also built a program for women in a previous company, 11 modules to help women to elevate themselves into senior positions in the tech industry generally. Global program, about 150 women on the program, and we were lucky enough to have executives as sponsors who helped the women to educate and elevate themselves. They had to do a lot of extra work from a program perspective to do so. And if anything about women, they tend to invest more in everybody else around them than they do themselves. But it always helps to have allies, and more importantly, to have sponsors who are interested in helping. And that does make a big difference in the world. And I think in the same way, we have an obligation from a leadership perspective to also be mentors and to be sponsors. I do a lot of mentorship with a number of people, men and women across the world. I've been doing that for a number of years. I continue to do that today because I just think if we have the opportunity, we should use the opportunity to help out, to educate, to guide, and just to help people navigate. The world is very difficult some days for some people, and everybody really does want to bring their best selves to work every day. It's not that people don't. Sometimes life just gets in the way, and everybody needs a little bit of support and a shoulder occasionally. So I think we ought to do that for each other.
It's spectacular giving back and kind of recognizing those limitations and how just giving a little bit of support to make such a huge difference. Is there some common thread across all of these mentoring experiences that you've had where you think there's something commonly that people struggle with or barriers that they have that stand in the way that you can say is true across, kind of maybe not 100% of them, but a broad spectrum of them?
So you ask an interesting question. Do you want to play a game?
I would love
Let's do it.
Okay, let's play a game quickly. And then I'll tell you what the common thread is. So without talking to each other, I want you to make notes, okay, as you do this. So I have been called to a client and rushed to the airport quickly. I'm sitting at the gate. I'm waiting in the airport lounge. I look around me. I'm sitting opposite a restaurant. I see a couple and they're looking like they're very much in love. Sitting, chatting. You can see they're whispering softly to each other. Ding dong, bell goes. We have to board the plane. We get on the plane. The captain's standing at the front of the cockpit. greets us all as we're walking in, and the air steward helps us to our respective seats. Sit down, somebody sits next to me, starts chatting. Eventually, I read my book and we get to the other side, get out, pull a cab, rush into my meeting. Nabeel, the couple in the restaurant, tell me what you saw.
They were whispering, they were talking to each other quietly, probably engaged in a conversation. There's probably this emotional element to it.
Was there a male and a female?
I don't know.
What did you think? What was the picture in your head?
Well, we live in a free society, so it could be
What
anyone.
was the picture in your head?
I actually didn't even process that, unfortunately. I left it very open. But then again, it's probably the upbringing as well. So it wasn't a male female or male male or female female. I did not even go that far.
Well, what was the couple in your head?
The couple in my head was certainly male, female. I pictured myself, I think, as one of them. Like I pictured myself engaged in conversation because I don't know why my head went there, but I'm like, as you describe it, I'm envisioning myself engrossed in conversation. And so, yeah, I don't know what that means. It probably means I'm broken.
Okay, so let me just tell you, if I ask 90% of people this question, and I have, by the way, I have trained hundreds of people on diversity and inclusion and unconscious bias, I can tell you that 90% of the people I've done this exercise with did not imagine a gay couple, did not imagine a couple of color, did not imagine anyone with a disability. When you think about the captain, nobody imagined the captain could be a Black female. Nobody imagined the air steward could be a male. Nobody imagined that my cab driver could have been a female with a disability. My point is, unconscious bias is something we all have. The whole world, I don't care who you are, where you come from, what your background is, has unconscious biases. It's a product of who we are, where we come from, our environment, how we grow up, and our experiences through life. I think the thread for me has been unconscious bias. And I've seen that throughout my career, and I see it in day-to-day life. And that's what gets in the way of equal opportunity. And that's the thread that I've picked up with every single person I have mentored.
So you think 90% of the people fall under that bracket, unconscious bias?
Of the 300, maybe 400 executives I've trained, I have done those exercises and a few others. Absolutely.
I would imagine that number to be a lot higher, but then again, you've done the exercise. Well, that's great to know.
Well, that's because you are assuming there's a certain demographic in that number. Unconscious bias.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I think
people with disabilities in that number as well. So,
yeah,
I will say this: just hearing the story, and I think people will pick up on this during the recording. The accent makes it captivating. You could say anything, and I feel
Phil just has a thing for accents.
I think the South African one in particular. It's like I was mesmerized. I didn't even know what. Like I knew that I needed to be paying attention, but I've never been so captivated by what is seemingly a fairly ordinary like story of what happens in a day. But the way you describe it, and maybe it's the accent, maybe it's just the affect, just captivating. I think there's voiceover work in your future. My God,
I'll try to remember that when I don't have bronchitis.
Move over, James Earl Jones. You can narrate the phone book to me, and I think
don't tell Trevor Noah that; he'll be most offended.
I think he knows it. I think he knows.
Yeah. All right. So stepping back into technology.
What is this podcast about? I forget. Technology. That's right.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about.
And based on your experiences, and not necessarily coming from a background of a very tech savvy upbringing and not even being on the radar at early part of your career, you took a relatively big risk of getting into a sector that was sort of non-existent or we didn't really know it's going to end up to where it is today. Could you share that journey and that transition point in making that decision? Okay, well, this is something I want to pursue, not necessarily knowing how big this will end up being in the next decade or two.
Honestly, I had no idea. I just like to learn new things, and I hate being the dumbest person in the room. And it was such a vast industry with so many different disciplines. And the people were so incredibly interesting and so willing to share their knowledge. And they were just happy that somebody was interested and wanted to listen to them speak. And I think it's important just to listen to understand, because you get so much input and so much information from people. And it was always just interesting to me. You just never run out of stuff to talk about. And it's a constantly changing environment with constant challenges. Coming from Africa, the challenges are a little more complicated because of the power situation. It is difficult. And so that was even more interesting for me, because the challenges there are not the same necessarily as the challenges one would experience here or in Asia or even in Europe. And having worked on multiple continents, the approaches have some cultural differences, but the technology is all very similar. But you will find in places where there's a lot less investment and a lot less education, that the solutions tend to be creative and innovative. Early on, probably 2011, was already dabbling with alternative power devices, which was something I needed to figure out because I was working with people in data centers. And a lot of the training we did, we had people from all aspects of the data center industry in our training. And we'd spend a lot of time talking about power and how the lack of power or inconsistent power or constantly interrupted power had an effect on all of your equipment and what that did to your facility. And the fact that you needed a different skill set, and you needed people who were resilient, and you needed people who could think outside of the box. Because when things happen, there's no manual that teaches you what happens, right? We did all the manual training. That didn't prepare us for 16 hours of no power on a continued basis. That's been a really interesting place to work. And having worked on the technology side, doing digital transformation, I worked in cybersecurity. I did a lot of post-merger integration work. I worked a lot with technical infrastructure, service delivery applications. All of that stuff resides in a data center, right? So it's been really interesting because it's a whole ecosystem, and one thing affects everything else.
Indeed. I think what we ought to do is, in order for the primary markets to address the power capacity and power challenge, we need to learn from Africa. They can operate data centers with 4 to 16 hours of load shedding. We got to be able to find a solution.
No, you just have bikes outside of the data center, and then that's how you work out. You just have people on stationary bikes generating the electricity. Come on, what's greener than that? Come on.
Yeah, we tried solar power way before solar power became a thing. We had wind farms probably 20 years ago already. Those were some of the things that we were already playing with at that point in time. Not specifically for the data center, but very quickly became things that the data center industry could tap into, which was not something anybody had ever thought could happen.
To a certain extent, I think in the US, we're limited somewhat by the kind of maturity of the infrastructure because it's there as a concept, as opposed to some of these more, and I'm not a huge fan of the term emerging markets, but let's just use it. Any of these emerging markets that might not be like beholden to the kind of the technical debt that comes along with these systems that have been in place since the 1800s. So you get to kind of build something greenfield on a foundational level in a way that there's a lot of kind of old guard that needs to be disrupted in kind of a mature infrastructure like the US. This has been amazing. I think to round it out, I think what we typically ask is, what would you tell to your younger self? But in this particular scenario, it's like you went through all of these changes in your life. You had a path. First, you wanted to be a nurse and a firefighter and a nun. Let's say the nun phase, and then you moved into financial services, and then you found the data center phase, and then you climbed Kilimanjaro and brain tumor and moving everyone from Africa to Virginia. In all of those experiences, can you crystallize a couple of things that surprised you about that path, or you would have told yourself that you might have been worried about, that you shouldn't have been worried about because you've learned through this experience that X, Y, and Z was the case, that might provide some insight to an audience that is always kind of fearful of change just because of the human condition that you've been able to experience? It's a long-winded question, I know.
So I love change. Change is cool, which is probably why I like digital transformation so much. It's kind of my game. It's my gig. I think I have a bit of philosophy that says change is constant. Best you figure out how to live it because it's cool. Best you get your arms around it really, really quickly because you're constantly going through change. And if you don't, then you're not growing and you're not learning. And you should never stop learning. You should always make sure you're surrounded by people who are smarter than you and who don't think like you, because you'll get different perspectives on things. And I certainly try to do that all the time. My friends are from all over the world, and I learn stuff from them all the time. And the way you see something may not be the way anybody else in the world sees it. You can learn something from that. And so if you're constantly surrounding yourself with people who are smarter than you, you're always going to be learning new things. I think we have a lot to be grateful for, every single one of us. We can get grumpy, we can get very self-absorbed, but the world is bigger than us, right? And we have to give back. And if you want to give back, it's important for you to then embrace change, because you can't give back unless you're also growing continuously. So I live by the motto that says, the tough stuff, this too shall pass. It will. Nothing stays the same. And if you want to change something, change it. You need to be the change you want to see in the world. So get on with it.
What a way to say it. This has been amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. This has been lovely. We'll have information on Deidre and Powering Potential and our partnership with Powering Potential in the write-up here as well, and all the necessary links. Deid, thank you very much for your time. It's been lovely to get to spend some time with you.
I think we tend to say that these stories are inspirational, and many cases we're kind of lying. In this particular case, the inspiration is off the charts. And that's not just because of the accent, I swear. It's incredible. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. There's nothing to be inspired about. Everybody has their challenges. Everybody has their crosses, but we all have the ability to do something great every day. We just got to get up and get on with it.
You should write greeting cards.
This has been great. Nothing lasts forever. Markets will come back, currencies will rebound, businesses will go on, and we will all move on. That could happen next week, next month, or next year. At Nomad Futurist, we're confident that those who prepare rather than panic will come out of this stronger. Thank you for joining us. This has been brought to you by Nomad Futurist. Check us online at nomadfuturist.org. And thank you for listening and subscribing, as well as your continued support.